A few years ago, I was able to hike the Camino de Santiago. If you've ever seen or heard about the Camino, maybe somebody here has also hiked it. But if you have, or if you've heard of it, then you know the Camino is a pilgrimage route that goes across the north of Spain from the French border to the city of Santiago, close to the coast. The pilgrimage route follows that path and reaches Santiago because, according to legend, it's in Santiago that James, one of the apostles, one of the 12 who followed Jesus, it's where he's buried. There's a large cathedral erected there over his burial site, and pilgrims for more than 1,200 years have been following paths to come to Santiago. And one of the interesting things about that trip is that it usually takes about a month to go from the French border all the way to Santiago. Usually, the people traveling along the Camino, the pilgrims, they spend the night in what are kind of like hostels. The Spanish use the word albergue, and it is like a hostel, usually big dorm rooms, very simple accommodations. Sometimes they're a little bit nicer than others. But here's what's interesting, is that whenever anyone stays at one of those hostels, in one of those albergues, the rules are always that you can stay one night and that's it. You have to move on. Now, what I learned about this is the fact that they have that rule because inevitably, as people make their way along the Camino, sooner or later, they reach a point where they just want to stop for at least one more night and stay in the same place. Somehow it is that to go along that path, you're never sure where you're going to end, and when you do, you're never sure where you're going to sleep, and you're never sure where you're going to get a meal. So sometimes if you get all those questions answered, it just seems to be human nature to want to stop and stay and rest and say, this may not be the greatest place in the world, but I know this, and I just want to stay this night. Now, what I'm trying to describe for you is, in essence, human nature. There's something about all of us that at times prefers the familiar, what's comfortable, what's known, kind of the routine that we're used to. That's just human nature. We catch a glimpse of that in the passage which we heard this morning and in other places of the story of the people of Israel in Exodus. This is the time when they are making their way from being captives and slaves in Egypt to the promised land. They're traveling, as we heard, through the wilderness of Sinai. But it's inevitable that part of human nature that I'm trying to describe kicks in. Sooner or later, those people along the way begin to grumble and begin to wish even that they were back in Egypt. Now, we might scratch our heads and say, how could they prefer being slaves in Egypt to wandering through the wilderness? But it's this thing of preferring sometimes what is familiar, what is known, to what is unknown. To travel through the wilderness was to be in brand new territory. It was to face challenges that they had never faced before, to put up with hardships they had never had to endure. It was probably inevitable they were going to be wishing that they could go back to what they had known. We hear in the passage this morning that Jan read that God goes before the people of Israel, that God is in a cloud by day and a fire by night, so they can keep moving throughout the day and the night. And what I'd want to emphasize is that is the plan. They will keep moving. No matter whether they start wishing they could just rest for a while, no matter whether they start feeling nostalgic for what they once had known, the plan of God is to have them continue on their journey to reach the promised land. God's going to guide them and lead them on the way, but they're not going to take time to stop and rest. In some ways, what I'm describing here is something like a little book. It was written a long, long time ago. It was a book called Western Theology. It was written by an Episcopal priest whose name was Wes Seelinger. And Wes Seelinger, in trying to talk about what it means to be a Christian, particularly in this day and time, he drew on kind of two pictures from the Old West, kind of stereotypes, but two pictures from the Old West. He talked about there being settlers and there being pioneers. Now, as you might guess, in Wes Seelinger's mind, a settler is somebody who wants to settle down, plant roots. Somebody who gets to a certain place and they say, this is it. They want to start building permanent structures, houses, churches, courthouse, schools, all of those kinds of things that become a part of routine of life. Settlers would be those who like the comfort of what is known as opposed to what is unknown, who love the kind of routines that come when you've been in the same place time after time after time. The contrast in his mind was with those who were pioneers. He envisions, again, using an image of the Old West, he envisions a wagon train, a group of people who are heading out into uncharted territory. Who knows what challenges they're going to face and what hardships are going to be on the way. But they somehow have in themselves that desire to see what's around the bend, to get to a place maybe better than what they've known. Again, that's the contrast that Seelinger describes. And he offers these two models, settlers, pioneers, and he really doesn't offer them as kind of being equal, that we can all pick and choose which one we'd like to be. He said, yes, there's a little bit of settler in all of us, but in his mind, what we're really called to be is pioneers. To be a follower of Christ is to be open to the idea that we're constantly on the move. Things just may never be the same today as they were yesterday. There are going to be new challenges, new hardships. But that's what it means to follow Christ. It's to be willing to go to new places and do new things, all that we might be about his work. In a way that you could say that was the second passage which we heard this morning. The passage that Emily has read comes from the book of Acts that talks about the Apostle Paul and his being a missionary. It's a kind of a peculiar time. They've been kind of confined, and the passage says the Holy Spirit wanted Paul and his followers to stick to kind of what was known, the familiar area of the Eastern Mediterranean. But there comes a time when Paul has a vision, and the vision is that he has to now go into the part of the Mediterranean we would call Europe. And he has to respond there to the plea from the man from Macedonia, that's Greece. He has to respond to his plea that the good news of Christ might be preached there. It's a perfect example of what I'm trying to describe for you today, about what I mean when I say that's more nearly what it means to follow Christ. We are called to go into new places, places we've never been before, because that's how we do the work of Christ. There are always new challenges. The world's constantly changing, and there's no way we can constantly be settlers if we're going to be faithful. But the good news is, to go back to Exodus, we have God as our guide. We're not doing this alone. We have the presence of God, the presence of Christ, to lead us on our way. And even more so, we don't do this alone because we are indeed part of a group that travels together. That's part of the hope we have. We are going through uncharted territories, but we're not alone. In a real way, that's what this day of All Saints is about. It's a time for us to remember that we've never been alone on our journeys as Christians. That we have people who have been dear to us. Some are still with us, others have gone on. But they are the ones who have been our companions, our brothers and sisters as we have traveled on our way. All Saints is a time for us to remember, and it's incredibly important that we do remember. It gives us hope, it gives us encouragement to remember others. This day is about remembering that when we travel, when we're pilgrims, we have God's guidance and we have the help of others. You know, whenever I come to All Saints' Day, amongst the people I want to remember is the man who taught my 8th grade Sunday school class. His name was Mr. Rich. And what I would want to tell you as background as to why I remember him is that year in the life of our church, we had a very unique group of 8th grade boys. Now, I'm being kind and generous when I say they were unique. They were a handful. They were a mess. That was the other ones, not me, of course. But the church, after dealing with these boys for a while, had decided to have a class just for them. A class for the 8th grade boys. Church had never done that before, never did it since, but that year was special. We were special. We had our own class. I think the church thought we were a bad influence on the 8th grade girls, so it thought if it could separate us, at the very least, there wouldn't be that much damage done. So the church created this class, and somehow they persuaded Mr. Rich to come and to teach us. And he did. Now, I wish I could tell you that I remember anything that he taught us that year. I'm afraid I don't. But what I do remember is the fact that one day, in the middle of class, I had what was for me a very adult thought. Because as I was sitting in the class listening to Mr. Rich talk, it all of a sudden occurred to me, and I said to myself, he doesn't have to do this. Now, maybe the other 8th grade boys knew that. I just thought somehow, I guess, that adults who teach 8th grade boys have to do it. Maybe they got their arm twisted, or maybe they just enjoyed making other people bored out of their minds. I had all those other kinds of thoughts, but not that day. That day, suddenly, like a bolt of lightning, it hit me. He doesn't have to do this, but he's doing it because he cares about us, and he cares about what he's teaching. And I was never the same again. I got to be honest. I wish I could have gone back. Our family, unfortunately, we moved a long ways away from where that class was. I never got a chance to go back and tell him what an influence he had upon me, and how I wished that when the time came, I could do hard things because I cared about other people. I always want to remember him, though, on All Saints' Day. And I want to thank God that God put Mr. Rich in my life. It's what I'm describing for you today, is when we go through this life and on our journey towards our promised land, we're not alone. God guides us, and there's others around us that are encouraging us, influencing us, guiding us. And this is the day that we remember. Amen.